Hello and welcome back to Reformed Thinking. I'm really glad you could join us today.
It's good to be here.
If you're listening to this, you probably fit the profile of what we like to call the learner. You're not here for just the inspirational quotes or the surface level stuff.
Right. You want to get into the gears of it all.
Exactly. You want to understand the machinery of the Christian life. You want to know how the theology we talk about actually hits the pavement of daily living, and to be honest, why it often feels so incredibly hard to do what we know we're supposed to do.
And that difficulty is a real thing. It's not something to be brushed aside. We're not interested in platitudes today. We really want to look at the mechanics of our redemption. Why is it a struggle? And what has actually been done about that struggle?
To get at those questions, we're pulling a classic off the shelf. We're going to be looking at C.S. Lewis and specifically a section from Mere Christianity.
A book that almost everyone in this space has read or at least knows about.
For sure. And I know everyone quotes Lewis. He's kind of the coffee mug theologian for a lot of people, which is fine. But we're going to a specific chapter that I think gets overlooked sometimes because it's a little weird.
It is.
It's the chapter he titled The Obstinate Toy Soldiers.
Such a strange image to use for these grand doctrines. But I would argue it's one of his most precise and helpful analogies for understanding the incarnation and what we call sanctification.
Why do you say that?
Because it captures the resistance we feel toward God, that inner friction, better than almost anything else I've ever read. It makes the abstract feel very, very concrete.
Okay, so the mission for this deep dive is, I think, pretty straightforward. We want to understand Lewis's answer to a huge question. Why is the Christian life so hard? And connected to that, what did Jesus actually achieve by becoming a human being? Because Lewis is going to argue it's a lot more than just teaching us to be nice people or setting a good example.
Far more. It's a fundamental change in reality itself.
Yeah.
And if we want to frame this theologically, as Lewis does, we're going to be looking at the distinction he draws between two Greek words for life, bios and zoe.
Right. Bios and Zoe.
And we're going to look at why, in our current state, those two forms of life are not just different, they're at war with one another.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Bios and Zoe. It does sound a bit like something out of a sci-fi novel, but Lewis starts right out of the gate with a pretty bold summary statement. He says the Son of God became a man to enable men to become sons of God.
That's the headline, the whole argument in one sentence.
It is, and before he even defines his terms, he does this interesting thing where he moves into a kind of what-if scenario. He speculates a bit.
He does this often. He likes to clear the ground by showing what could have been, to highlight what is. He says, look, we don't know for sure how things would have worked if the human race hadn't rebelled against God, if the fall, as we read about it in Genesis, had never happened.
I love when he does this because he's just admitting, hey, I'm guessing here, but it's a helpful guess. He says maybe, just maybe, if we hadn't rebelled, the bios, which is that natural biological life we all have.
The life of animals and vegetables, the life that decays.
Right. That life would have just been drawn up into the Zoe, the spiritual, uncreated life that God has.
Yeah.
Sort of automatically. It would have been a natural progression.
A smooth transition, no friction at all, like a seed growing into a flower or a child growing into an adult. It would have been the intended path.
But Lewis pivots very quickly from that. He says, and I'm quoting here, but that is guesswork. We can't live in that theoretical what if. We have to deal with the reality on the ground.
And that reality is messy.
It is. And he says the reality is that these two types of life, bios and Zoe, are not just different from each other now. They are opposed. They are in conflict.
This is such a critical point because I think you're right. So many of us, when we first become Christians, we think of the spiritual life as just natural life plus some religious activities.
Yeah, like, I'm still me. I have all my same basic desires and instincts, but I go to church now and I try not to cuss.
Exactly. It's an add-on, an accessory. But Lewis is saying, no, no, no. The natural life itself, the bios in its fallen state, is actively fighting against the spiritual life. It sees Zoe as an enemy.
So let's define them a bit more clearly then, the way he does. Bios is the life we get from nature.
Right. It's biological. It's what you have in common with a dog or a cabbage. It needs food. It needs air. It runs on a clock, and it eventually runs down and dies.
And Zoe.
Zoe is the spiritual life that is in God from all eternity. It's uncreated. It doesn't run down. It's the source of bio. It's the life that created the entire universe.
And the problem since the fall is that the bios in us has become fundamentally self-centered. It's turned inward on itself.
Yes, that's the core of the opposition. The natural life has made itself the center of everything.
He paints a really unflattering picture of this self, doesn't he?
Mm-hmm.
I was reading this, and I have to admit, I felt a little called out. He says the natural life wants to be petted and admired.
It does. It craves attention. It wants to be the center of gravity in every room. All its desires and calculations are ultimately about protecting and promoting itself.
And then he says it wants to exploit the universe. I mean, that's such a strong phrase.
It is, but think about it. It's not just that I want a sandwich because I'm hungry. It's that my natural self wants the universe to arrange itself so I can have the best possible sandwich, and maybe that everyone else sees me with my great sandwich and tells me how great I am at finding sandwiches.
That is a perfect illustration of it. It's not about need. It's about ego.
It's about making everything and everyone else an instrument for my own satisfaction.
And then there's a darker, more defensive side to it, which Lewis points out. He says the self doesn't just want to be admired, it also desperately wants to be left alone.
To be kept away from anything better or stronger or higher than itself, because that makes it feel small. The natural self cannot stand to feel small. If you stand next to something genuinely infinitely superior, your own ego shrinks. Your self-importance withers. And the natural self hates that feeling more than anything.
So it's terrified of the spiritual world. It's terrified of God, not just because of guilt, but because God's very existence is an affront to its own desire to be number one.
Precisely. It's terrified of the light and air of the spiritual world because it knows that in that light, it is no longer the king of its own little kingdom. Its authority is challenged.
This is where he uses that analogy of the dirty child. This one really stuck with me. He says the natural self fears the spiritual world, just as people who have been brought up to be dirty are afraid of a bath.
It's such a visceral image, isn't it?
It really is.
Imagine a child who has never known anything but grime and filth. To that child, the dirt isn't dirt. It feels like a warm layer of clothes. It feels like protection. It's familiar.
It's his identity. I'm the dirty kid.
Right. And then along comes a parent saying, I'm going to strip all that off of you and scrub you raw with soap and hot water. To that child, that doesn't sound like hygiene. It doesn't sound like love. It sounds like torture. It sounds like a violent assault on who he is.
And the cold. You can just picture the kid screaming, fighting against it.
And Lewis says, in a sense, it is quite right. The child is right to be afraid, from his point of view. The self knows that if the spiritual life, if Zoe gets a hold of it, all of that self-centeredness is going to be killed.
It has to be.
It has to be. So the natural life perceives the coming of the spiritual life as an existential threat. It's not just about changing a few habits. The bios knows that Zoe is its executioner.
Not that the person will cease to exist.
No, not at all. But the tyranny of the self, the rule of that inward-looking ego, will be executed. It must be for the real person to come alive. And so it fights. It fights tooth and nail to avoid the bath.
This whole setup, this whole conflict, brings us to the central image of the chapter, which is the toy soldier. And I think this is one of Lewis's best thought experiments because it's so simple on the surface, but the more you think about it, the deeper and deeper it goes.
Walk us through it. Lay out the analogy as he does.
Okay, so he asks you, the reader, to imagine you're a child. And like any child, you've probably thought, wouldn't it be fun if my toys came to life?
Right, like Toy Story. It's a universal childhood fantasy.
It is. We all get the appeal of that.
Yeah.
But Lewis puts a twist on it. He says, suppose you actually had the power to turn a tin soldier into a real little man.
Not just a walking, talking toy, but actual flesh and blood.
Exactly. A living, breathing human being. Now, to us, the creators, the ones with the power, that sounds like a wonderful gift. A miracle. We're upgrading the soldier from tin to life.
We're giving him a promotion.
We think we are.
Yeah.
But then Lewis says, now, think about it from the soldier's point of view.
Okay.
What is the soldier made of? He's made of tin. He likes being tin. He understands tin. It's his nature. He's shiny. He's hard. He doesn't get sick. He doesn't bleed. He doesn't get cold or hungry.
He's stable. He's predictable.
That's it. So if you come to him and say, I'm going to turn you into flesh, he doesn't think, oh boy, I get to be human. He thinks, you're going to make me soft. You're going to make me squishy and vulnerable. You are spoiling the tin.
He perceives the elevation as a destruction. That is the absolute key insight here. To the tin soldier, becoming a man looks like death. It looks like the killing of his tin nature.
So he resists. He thinks you're killing him. And Lewis says, he will do everything he can to prevent you. He will not be made into a man if he can help it.
And this, Lewis argues, is our exact position in relation to God. We are the obstinate toy
It's
soldiers.
so humbling when you put it that way.
It is. We are clutching our tin nature, our sins, our self-protection mechanisms, our pride, our comfortable habits, because we think that's what makes us who we are. We think that's what's holding us together.
So when God comes to us with the offer of Zoe, with real eternal life, we don't initially see it as a gift. We see it as a threat. We see it as God trying to ruin our fun or destroy our identity.
We fight against the very thing that is meant to make us real. We are fighting to stay as tin statues because we are terrified of the vulnerability and the demands of being real men and women.
And there's a strong reformed undertone here, isn't there? I mean,
Yeah.
this is basically the doctrine of total depravity and total inability laid out in an analogy.
Absolutely. Notice the soldier cannot turn himself into a man. It's impossible. The tin has no capacity within itself to generate flesh. It has to be done to him from the
Right.
outside.
And not only can he not do it, he actively resists it. He doesn't want it. If it were up to the soldier's free will, he would choose to remain tin forever.
That's a perfect picture of what the Westminster Confession means when it says the will is in bondage to sin. We are unable and unwilling to choose God on our own terms. We prefer the tin.
Wow, that's a heavy realization. We are fighting the cure. So if the soldiers, that's us, are resisting and we can't change ourselves and we don't even want to be changed, what does God do?
Well, that's the whole point. What is the solution to that dilemma?
This is what leads us directly to the incarnation.
This is where the story shifts from our obstinance to God's incredible mind-bending intervention. Since the soldiers would not and could not submit to the change, God did something completely radical. The Creator became part of the creation. The second person of the Trinity, the eternal Son, became a tin soldier.
I love how Lewis grounds this. He doesn't just say he became human in some vague, abstract way. He gets so specific. He says God became a real man, a man of a particular height,
With hair of a particular color.
speaking a particular language, probably Aramaic with a Galilean accent, weighing a certain amount.
It removes all the religious abstraction. We often think of Jesus as this sort of glowing, ethereal figure in a stained glass window. Lewis is forcing us to remember he had a specific genetic code. He had DNA. He got splinters in his hands.
And he goes even further back, which is even more staggering. He says this eternal being who knows everything and holds everything together became a fetus inside a woman's body.
Dependent. Helpless. The scandal of the incarnation is right there. The infinite becoming finite. The container of the entire universe being contained in a womb.
To help us grasp the sheer shock of this, Lewis uses another analogy here that I have to say I found it genuinely shocking. I actually laughed out loud when I read it, but it was a nervous laugh.
I know the one you mean.
He says, if you want to get the hang of it, think how you would like to become a slug or a crab.
It is jarring, isn't it? It feels almost blasphemous to put it that way.
It feels offensive.
It's supposed to. He's doing that on purpose. We tend to think of humanity as this noble, beautiful thing, man is the measure of all things. We think, of course, God would want to be one of us. It's an honor.
Right, it's the highest form of life we know.
But Lewis is saying, compared to the uncreated, eternal, blazing glory of the divine nature, humanity, this biological, limited, decaying thing is slimy. We're dragging ourselves through the mud. For God to become man is an infinitely greater descent, a far greater humiliation than for you or me to become a slug.
That really reframes the humiliation of Christ. We tend to think of it as just the cross. But Lewis is saying it was the whole thing. It was being born, it was having to learn to walk, it was having a diaper, it was going through puberty. It was the whole experience of being a slug compared to what he was before.
And yet, by doing this, by undertaking this incredible descent, he achieved something that had never existed in the history of the universe before.
Okay, so what did he achieve by becoming a slug, so to speak? Lewis says the result was that you now had one man who really was what all men were intended to be.
One perfect specimen. One tin soldier that had finally and fully become a man. But the process of how that happened is vital here. Lewis points out that the created life in Jesus, the bios he inherited from his mother, Mary, was completely and perfectly turned into Zoe. He was totally taken up into the divine Son.
But that wasn't an easy process, was it? It wasn't like a magic trick where he just snapped his fingers and the bios was transformed. Lewis keeps using this language of killing. The natural life has to be killed to make room for the spiritual.
Yes, and for us, that killing process is painful because we resist it. We fight the whole way. For Christ, he didn't have a sinful nature that resisted, but he still had to willingly submit his biological will, his human desires, to the divine will at every single moment, and the world fought him for it constantly.
Lewis gives a list of the things that killed his human desires, and it's a brutal list. He starts with poverty.
Just the daily grind of not having enough, the lack of comfort and security that the natural self craves.
Then, misunderstanding from his own family. That one hits hard. Imagine being the black sheep, the weird one in your family, because you are actually perfect and everyone else is broken.
To be seen as mad by the people who should have known you best.
Then, betrayal by his intimate friends, the people in his inner circle.
And then Lewis uses this very modern-sounding phrase, being jeered at and manhandled by the police.
That phrase just brings it right down to earth, doesn't it? It strips away all the religious gloss. He was arrested, he was shoved around, he was publicly humiliated by the authorities.
He was a victim of state-sanctioned violence.
And finally, execution by torture. Lewis's point is that Christ was killed every day, in a sense. He was constantly having to suppress the natural human desire for safety, for comfort, for reputation, for his own ego, in order to allow the Zoe life to flow through him perfectly.
And then you have the climax of that whole process. After being physically killed on the cross, the human creature in him, because it was perfectly united to the divine Son, rose again. And this is the point Lewis wants us to grasp with all our might. The man in Christ rose. Not just the God part. The bios, now fully transformed into Zoe, came back to life.
He says one tin soldier, real tin, just like the rest, had come fully and splendidly alive. That's the payoff of the whole story. For the first time in human history, we saw a real man.
Everyone else up to that point had been a half-finished statue or a broken toy. Jesus was the first one to actually be human in the way we were all designed to be from the beginning.
He blazed the trail. He broke the mold of the tin existence and established a whole new category of being, glorified humanity.
Precisely.
But here's where the skeptic in me, and in Lewis's audience, comes in. Lewis anticipates this objection perfectly. The skeptic says, okay, great. So one soldier turned into a man. Good for him. Wonderful story. What does that have to do with me? I'm over here on the other side of the toy chest. I am a separate soldier.
And this is where Lewis brilliantly deconstructs our modern Western individualism. He says, here my illustration about the tin soldier breaks down.
Why does it break down?
Because toy soldiers really are separate pieces of metal. They're manufactured individually. If one of them magically comes to life, the guy standing next to him on the shelf stays tin. There's no connection.
Right. But Lewis is going to argue that human beings are not separate in that way. We just think we are. We suffer from a kind of optical illusion.
The illusion of time.
Exactly. We see people walking around as separate individuals because we can only perceive the present moment. We're seeing a thin cross-section of reality. But Lewis asks us to imagine seeing humanity the way God sees it, spread out across all of history at once.
It's a mind-bending thought experiment.
It is. He uses the tree illustration here. He says if you could see humanity spread out in time, it wouldn't look like a bunch of little separate dots walking around. It would look like one single massive growing thing, a complicated tree.
And each one of us is like a leaf or a small twig on that tree.
Think about it just on a biological level. You're not truly separate from your parents. You grew out of them. You were physically a part of your mother for 9 months. She was physically a part of her mother. If you trace it back, humanity is one continuous biological organism that has been branching out for thousands of years.
That really messes with our modern sense of self, doesn't it? We think of ourselves as islands. I am me, you are you, we are separate. But physically, that's not entirely true. We are just different branches of the same human tree.
And Lewis adds that spiritually, we're not separate from God either. He says we're only breathing right now in this moment because God is keeping us going breath by breath. We're utterly dependent.
So if we are all part of one human mass, or one tree, as he puts it, then what happens to one part of the tree has implications for the whole thing. What happens to the root inevitably affects all the branches.
That's correct. If we were totally separate individuals, like the tin soldiers, then Christ's work would just be an isolated event, a nice story, a museum piece.
But because humanity is one interconnected organism, when Christ, who is God, becomes a man, it's not just one soldier changing in a vacuum.
It's like, what's the other analogy? He uses the glass of water.
Right. It's like dropping something potent into a glass of water, a drop of dye maybe, or a potent chemical.
And it changes the color or the taste of the entire glass,
Yeah.
not just the spot where it landed.
Yes. When Christ, who is God, entered the human race, he entered the very bloodstream of humanity. He fundamentally altered the stuff of human nature at its core. This gets at that reformed doctrine of federal headship. Just as Adam's fall in the garden poisoned the whole glass of humanity, Christ's perfect obedience begins the process of purifying it.
Lewis puts it this way. It is as if something which is always affecting the whole human mass begins, at one point, to affect that whole human mass in a new way.
And from that one point in history, the incarnation, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, that new effect starts to spread. And here's a very interesting and sometimes controversial theological point Lewis makes. He says this effect spreads through all of mankind. It makes a difference even to people who lived before Christ.
Yeah, I caught that. I had to read that sentence twice. And he also says it affects people who have never even heard of him.
He's suggesting that the work of Christ changed the ontological status of humanity itself. It changed what it means to be human on a universal cosmic level. The infection of Zoe was introduced into the bios of the entire species, and now that life is available in a way it ever was before.
Okay, so this brings us to the so what question.
Yeah.
The practical application. We've got the war between Bios and Zoe. We've got the obstinate soldier. We have the incarnation where God became the first real man. We have this idea of the interconnectedness of the human race.
Right.
So how does that actually save me sitting here today?
Lewis is very clear on this, and his view here is, I think, very much in line with a reformed understanding of the finished work of Christ. He asks, what is the difference which he has made to the whole human mass? And his answer is this. The business of becoming a son of God, of turning from tin to flesh, has now been done for us.
He says humanity is already saved in principle. That's a bold statement.
It's a very bold statement, but what he means is that the hardest part, the impossible part, the part we could not do for ourselves, which is turning tin into flesh, is accomplished. The prototype now exists. The path has been cut through the jungle. The rope has been thrown down into the pit we were stuck in.
So we don't have to invent the spiritual life from scratch. We don't have to try and climb up to heaven to find it.
No, it has come down. He says, we have not got to try to climb up into spiritual life by our own efforts. It has already come down into the human race.
That is such a release. Because if you told me my salvation depended on me figuring out how to turn my own tin into flesh, I'd be hopeless.
Yeah.
I don't have the first clue how to do that.
None of us do. That's the whole point of the obstinate soldier. He cannot do it. But now, the power to do it is available. It's circulating in the human bloodstream, so to speak, because of Christ.
So what's our job then? If the tough work is done, do we just sit back and do nothing?
No, not at all. Our job shifts. It's no longer about creation, but about reception. Lewis says we must lay ourselves open to the one man. We have to get close to him.
This is where he brings in that fantastic concept of the good infection. I just love that phrase. We think of infection as a bad thing, a disease.
Right.
But here, he flips it. He says, one of our own race has this new life. If we get close to him, we shall catch it from him.
It's a contagion of life. Spiritual life is communicable. It spreads. If you stand near a fire, you get warm. If you jump in a pool, you get wet. If you get close to Jesus, you catch Zoe. You catch the spiritual life.
It makes faith sound less like a legal transaction, like signing a contract with God, and more like a relationship of proximity.
Mm-hmm.
You just hang out with the healthy person until you start to get healthy too.
Yeah. That is the absolute essence of it. In theological terms, we call it union with Christ. The more you open yourself to him through prayer, through the sacraments, through reading scripture, through fellowship, the more the tin in you begins to soften and transform into flesh. Not because you are trying really hard to be fleshy, but because his life is infecting yours.
Okay, now as he wraps up this section, Lewis addresses the how. He knows that people, especially theological people, love to argue about the precise mechanism of how the atonement works. Was it a payment of a debt? Was it a victory over evil? Was it a substitution?
The formulas, as he calls them, the theories of the atonement.
Right, and Lewis lists a few of the common ones. He says you can say Christ died for our sins. You can say the Father forgave us because of what Christ did. You can say we are washed in the blood of the Lamb. You can say Christ defeated death.
And his advice on this point is just pure pastoral wisdom. He says they're all true.
Wait, all of them? Even if they seem to emphasize different things?
Yes. Because they are all human attempts to describe a divine reality that is bigger than any one human formula. A photograph of a mountain from the east looks different than a photograph from the west, but it's the same mountain. These formulas are different angles on the same glorious event.
He actually says, if any of them do not appeal to you, leave it alone and get on with the formula that does. That is surprisingly liberating to hear.
It is. He's giving people permission to not have it all figured out, but then he adds the really important warning.
What's that?
Do not start quarreling with other people because they use a different formula from yours.
That is the kicker, isn't it?
Yeah.
My goodness, how much time and energy have Christians spent over the centuries fighting over the exact mechanics of the atonement while completely missing the good infection itself?
Far too much time. The formula is not the food. The formula is the description on the menu. You can stand there and argue about whether the font on the menu is optimal, or you can sit down and eat the meal. Lewis is pleading with us, eat the meal. The reality of the change, the actual experience of the tin turning to flesh, is infinitely more vital than the specific theory you use to explain it.
So let's just recap the flow of the argument we've walked through today. It's a pretty powerful journey.
It is.
We started with this fundamental war inside of us, the war between bios, our selfish natural life, and Zoe, God's spiritual eternal life. And we saw that we're like these obstinate tin soldiers who don't want to be changed because we think being changed means being destroyed.
Then we saw God's solution, that God, in the person of Christ, became a tin soldier himself to show us the way. He willingly submitted to the killing of his natural human desires in order to resurrect as the first real man, the prototype for a new humanity.
And we looked at how this wasn't just an isolated event, because humanity is like one big tree. We're all connected.
Yeah.
So what he did affects all of us. He dropped the cure, the Zoe life, into the glass of water that is the human race.
And finally, we saw that our role isn't to try and replicate that work, but to receive it, to stop resisting, get close to him, and let the good infection of his life take over in us, to accept the work that has already been done on our behalf.
It really is a thoroughly reformed way of looking at salvation when you break it down like that, isn't it? It is all of grace. It is all about him doing for us what we could not possibly do for ourselves.
It is. It takes the immense burden of self-creation off of our shoulders. We don't have to make ourselves real. We just have to surrender and let him do it.
That brings us to the end of the source material we wanted to cover. But before we sign off, I just want to leave you, the listener, with a thought to chew on this week.
What's on your mind?
It's that image Lewis gave us of the human tree. The idea that if we could see humanity spread out in time, as God sees it, it would look like one single, interconnected organism, every individual, past, present, and future, connected to every other.
Yes.
If that is true, I mean really, truly true, how does that change the way you view your neighbor? Or the person who cuts you off in traffic? Or even your enemy?
That's a sharp question.
If we are all just leaves on the same tree, does the health of one branch inevitably, in some way, determine the health of another? If I hate my enemy, if I wish them ill, am I essentially pouring a little bit of poison on my own branch of the tree?
It would seem so. If we are one organism, then there's really no such thing as a purely private sin or a purely private virtue. We are all participating in the life or the sickness of the whole body.
Something to think about next time you're stuck in traffic or scrolling through social media and feeling that anger rise up. We're all part of the same tin soldier army, just waiting and sometimes fighting to come to life.
Indeed. A sobering and a hopeful thought.
Thank you so much for listening to Reformed Thinking. We hope this deep dive into a little corner of Lewis gave you some fresh oxygen for your faith.
Keep thinking.
We'll see you next time.